Synopsis. At an opulent charitable gala where the city's elite glitter under crystal chandeliers, a quiet seamstress named Lila is publicly humiliated when an entitled socialite yanks up her skirt in a cruel joke. That moment ignites a careful, cinematic unraveling, shame, memory, and a slow-burning resolve. With the steady, principled support of her husband, Omar, and a daring ally in investigative journalist No, Lila navigates the corridors of power and reputation. As secrets are unearthed and alliances shift, the confrontation culminates in a charged public reckoning where a bully begs for mercy not to a judge or court, but before the woman she tried to crush and the husband who loves her. The story explores dignity, the quiet mechanics of power, and the choice between vengeance and justice, showing how a single simple woman converts humiliation into a force that remakes lives. The chandeliers rained like a slow meteor shower over the Vandenberg Grand Hall, their glass teeth slicing the dim into shards of gold. Crystal tinkled under the weight of champagne. Waiters moved like pale ghosts among clusters of gowns and tuxedos, balancing trays with the practiced indifference of servants used to the worship of other people's fortunes. The air smelled of gardenia, expensive perfume, and something older, an undercurrent of ambition so thick it was almost tactile. Lila stood just beyond the arcing reach of the ballroom's heat, hands folded at her waist, a small silhouette in a borrowed black dress that fit like a promise. She had come because Omar had asked her, because he said his work meant nothing without the world she kept soft at home, the simple rhythms of breakfast, his cufflinks found in odd places, the mended hem she insisted he wear when his suit started to fray. She had said she wouldn't like it. Too loud, too many eyes. But when Omar pressed his hand to the small of her back and said he would be proud if she stood beside him, she had let herself be proud. People turned, slowly, like the bloom of a wary flower, when the couple arrived. Omar's suit caught the light in a way that made the room accept him as it liked to accept Tower. Without question, wholeheartedly. Lila felt the small uncanny flutter of exposure and then, beneath it, a tether of calm. Omar always knew how to say her name in a way that made her sleeve of self slip away and left only her. Celia. Someone whispered nearby, breath sharp with amusement. The name slid through the crowd like a blade. Celeste Vandenberg, born into limelight, heiress to foundations and 1,000 little philanthropic causes the papers loved to photograph, was a presence in the room that could make silence feel like applause. She wore a gown the color of frozen rose and a smile that had been trained to sharpen at the edges. She moved with the entitlement of someone who had been given the script of every social scene and memorized it. Lila knew Celeste by face and rumor, a woman who never let the world forget her power. She knew, without the need to look, the interplay of glances as Celeste crossed paths with those she deemed lesser. There was always a quick intake of breath, the staccato keening of people waiting to see whether the heiress would bestow a favor or a scorn. Tonight, Lila felt the attention like a weight. The moment came with the cruel inevitability of a scripted farce. They were near the valet, feet brushing where velvet ropes thinned. Celeste's circle orbited with practiced grace. Someone made an introduction and then moved on. Lila's borrowed dress rustled when she shifted. She smiled, small and genuine, the kind of smile that expected nothing and gave even less in return. Celeste paused. It was nothing. 2 seconds. Then a hand, gloved in human silk and jewelry, latched at the fabric at Lila's hip. A flick. A laugh like a bell. The dress rose with the lightness of a curtain. For an instant Lila's skin met cold air where dress and dignity parted. The room gasped, some with accord, some with reflexive mirth. Phones blinked alive like a constellation snapped in a fraction of a second. A child of the wrong side of wealth would have crumpled then. Lila felt the flood, humiliation burning like grease under her ribs. Her stomach rolled, breath tightening into splinters. She reached for some anchor, Omar's hand, but the shove of 1,000 small eyes halted her like a current. She'll make a good story in the society pages, someone said, as if words could stitch the wound. Lila's face went hot, her mouth tasting bloodless metal. People smiled with the mean smiles of those who have practiced contempt and polished it to a sheen. Celeste's laugh lilted with triumph, a well-placed performance that seemed to demand more sound. She raised a fan, the motion casual, a queen flicking aside a bothersome wasp. She enjoyed the attention as if it were oxygen. Lila wanted to disappear into the seams of the dress, into the hem of the city. But someone else's hands were quieted by a memory of hands that had fixed a jam zipper at 2 a.m. That night when a hem had fallen and Lila had mended it with a threadless mercy that left no trace, when Omar had laughed and called her magic. Omar did not step in at once. He had the composure of a man who had practiced restraint in public and resolve in private. He took Lila's hand, fingers meeting like a familiar prayer, and the press of his palm sent through her a steadiness like gravity. He let the room carry its folly until the cameras moved, lenses hungry. Then he turned, and the small, domestic motion of his mouth became something known only to Lila: protect. After the glitter and the gossip, the gala dissolved back into its usual orbit. People forgot what they had been entertained by and moved on to other amusements, the next donation, the next photograph, the next small cruelty. But Lila did not forget. The image, Celia's hand lifting, was a stone dropped into the stillness of her bones. It made a ripple she could not smooth. That night, after coats and cufflinks had been returned, Omar walked her home through streets softened by rain. She watched him in the yellow wash of a street lamp and wondered if he could see the crack in the glaze, if perhaps the same world that admired him would let him down. He kept talking about the Foundation's next project, a shelter, a small clinic, but his words were pebbles that to throw at the surface of what had happened. He asked her if she wanted to speak about it tomorrow, publicly. He would say the right thing, he promised. Lila said no. She said, no cameras. She said it quietly, and Omar's expression loosened with that compassion she had come to rely on. He agreed, perhaps because he respected her choice, perhaps because he understood that sometimes dignity was preserved in silence and not spectacle. But silence is not a refuge for everyone. For Lila, silence began as sanctuary and then, like a closed room, threatened to become a prison. When she lay awake that night, images from the gala looped like a film strip: the tilt of Celeste's head, the hush of guests, her own skirt lifted like a paper flag. Humiliation, she thought, was a public weather. It arrived without warning and left tracks. The next morning Nur Khan came by the small apartment with her camera bag slung over her shoulder and a cup of strong tea. Nur smelled, always, of ink and lemon and the faint wire of late nights. She was a journalist whose notebook had the habit of unraveling polished reputations when she took a run at them. Nur had changed the city, slowly, ferociously, by pointing a microscope at the squeaky engine of society. I heard, Nur said before Lila could offer any small greeting. She did not ask permission for the cup. She simply set it down. I'm sorry. It's my fault, Lila said immediately, as if apology could be dispensed like tea. I should have worn something else. I shouldn't have. Nur shook her head. You don't owe an explanation. You were humiliated. People who humiliate people owe explanations. But the cameras. No, listen, Nur said, blunt and warm. She took a breath, leaned in. You don't have to make a public scene. But there's something we've both seen for a long time, the way Celeste uses social shame like currency. There are patterns, Lila. I work on patterns. Lila watched Nur in the way you watch someone who could remove a thorn without flinching. Nur slid a folder across the table. It held clippings of Celeste's philanthropic ventures, and beneath them, carefully folded, emails, invoices, a ledger of things given and favors traded. Nur had been tracking funds tied to Celeste's foundation, ghost payments, shell contractors, a pattern of siphoned donations mapped onto contractors who had ties to construction companies where Vandenberg's board members had personal stakes. You're not suggesting, Lila's voice trembled. No, Nur said, eyes luminous. I'm saying that Celeste isn't just cruel. She uses cruelty to distract. While people are laughing, other things happen. She tapped the ledger. Look. They spent the day together, unspooling the thread Nur had been following for months. Lila learned, in that slow, clarifying way things come into focus when someone else holds the lens steady, that the glitter of the grand halls often masked ledgers that hummed with the city's darker economies. She learned how reputation could be spun into a net that caught everything in it, and how those who wielded reputation like a weapon rarely had to answer for the harm they caused. Something tightened in Lila when she saw the dates, charitable pledges that coincided with zoning approvals and quiet transfers that lined pockets. The world she had always thought of as separate from her sits of work, sewing shops and small laundries, seemed contiguous with that gilded world, a thread that ran through both hem and ledger. Omar listened to their plan with an old, dangerous calm. "What do you want?" he asked simply when Noor had enumerated the evidence. His hand found Lila's, and she felt the same gravity as the night of the gala. The man had the steady patience of someone who'd learned to wait and then act when the time fit the cause. "I don't want to be the woman who cries publicly," Lila said. "I don't want to be known for the moment of my humiliation, as if that were all I ever was. But I want the truth to matter. I want what was stolen to be returned, where it belongs. I want an apology, but not the sort that comes from a press release." Omar's jaw tightened. "We can go legal. Noor can write an expose. There are ways to bring these ledgers into sunlight." Noor's smile was fierce. "We can make the world listen without it becoming a circus." They plotted with the precision of those who know how to stitch. Noor would line up the investigative piece, gather testimonies from contractors and whistleblowers. Omar would ready the legal channels, speak quietly to people who controlled the trajectories of boards and charities. Lila would decide the terms when the truth finally met the public. For weeks, they walked a careful line. Noor's pieces landed like well-placed stones, the first shaking loose pebbles of rumor, then more. Contractors folded under pressure and disclosed practices that had been normalized beneath the Vandenberg banner. There were denials, slick statements with practiced regret, but as the ledger's lines went higher and the evidence deeper, the sheen began to strip away. The city watched, then listened, then demanded accountability. All the while Lila practiced being present in her life with Omar, sewing hems and mending shirts, tasting the small pleasure of the domestic. She found an odd delight in these ordinary labors, pressing seams, joining two things and making them strong. Sewing, she thought, was a lesson in patience and in the faith that small, steady movements could bind larger wounds. Then came the reply Celeste Camp sent, a letter in embossed stationery and a legal retort framed like wounded pride. They demanded retraction. They threatened countersuits. They called Noor's reporting sensationalist. Celeste took to the social pages to declare her deep sorrow for any discomfort at the gala, a statement so hollow it sang like a bell with no clapper. It promised reform committees and cosmetic change. But Lila was not satisfied by plastic flower beds. The plan coalesced in Omar's study, surrounded by books that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old ink. Omar suggested an event, a forum, a public roundtable on philanthropy and accountability to be held at the hall where the gala had taken place, an invitation extended to donors, board members, and the press. It was, he said, the perfect stage. Celeste could not decline without showing herself unaccountable, and if she attended she would be in a place where every word and gesture could be scrutinized. "You're asking for a showdown," Noor said, eyebrows lifting. "A confrontation with light," Omar corrected. "We will give her the chance to stand in daylight. It's better than dragging people into courtrooms they can't escape." Lila's heart beat in her throat for a day, and then surrendered to a steadier drum. The forum was announced, and the city took to it with a hunger most people had been taught to disguise. Celeste accepted the invitation because she loved the lights and would be made of her own choice instead of being forced into shame. The night of the forum, the grand hall had a different feeling. The chandeliers still rained light, but now there was a sense of attention that was more like curiosity and less like appetite. Donors took their seats. Cameras lined the periphery like an impatient audience. Celeste arrived in confident armor, flanked by PR aides who smoothed the air around her like hands on silk. Her smile was the type that had been practiced in mirrors, perfected into an instrument. Lila sat in the third row, not at Omar's side this time, but one seat away. She wore a dress that was simple and honest, a cut that spoke of a person who did not need ornament to stand. Omar had arranged interviews and statements in private, hedging the edges, but everything depended on the public performance, on what could be shown in the light. The panel began with introductions. There were measured statements about the intersection of philanthropy and accountability. Celeste spoke of transparency and self-reflection. She was eloquent. She was glossy. She was practiced at making restitution sound like a brand launch. Noor's piece had set the tone, facts lined like a backbone under Lila's skin. As the panel moved to questions from the audience, a hush settled. The first few questions were gentle, designed to allow Celeste to float. Then a woman stood up, a former contractor whose voice had the crackle of having had to swallow much in her life. She told her story of a project delayed, of funds redirected, of doors closed once people began to talk. The hall listened. The press scribbled. When the microphone finally reached Celeste, she smiled as if each accusation was a cloud that could be blown away with perfume. Lila felt a coil of anger, then a settling. The coil was not the sharpness of want for vengeance, it was the steady heat of clarity. She stood up, an unexpected movement that felt like a seam coming undone and then being stitched into being. The room turned. Lila. Omar's voice was low, a question that tasted of surprised affection. She walked to the podium with the steadiness of someone who had practiced this walk in the quiet of her apartment when no one watched. Up close, Celeste looked the way she had at the gala, polished features, an air that had been cultivated to keep cruelty palatable. The room thrummed, the cameras leaning in like moths. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lila began, her voice finding a thread and pulling. "You know me as someone who sometimes mends garments and keeps a small part of her life private. I've always believed in simple things, that a seam that holds is a small kind of faith, that you can mend something and still keep its memory." A polite murmur ran through the room. Celeste's eyes were a quick knife. Lila allowed herself to remember the way the dress had risen at the gala, the laughter like a bell. "There are things," Lila continued, "that happen in public and then are written off as a joke. You may laugh at the woman whose skirt lifts because it entertains you. But while you laugh, something else is happening. Money that people trusted to build shelter and clinics was sometimes rerouted. There were contractors who weren't paid. There were families who were promised a roof and were left with a ledger entry. We are here under the pretense of generosity, but generosity became a cloak for profit." No one spoke. The hush was a taut wire. Lila turned and looked at Celeste. "You showed the world how easily our shame can be a spectacle," she said. "But what you did is not only cruel. It was a distraction." At Newell's nod, the big screen behind the panel flickered to life. Under the polite glare of the hall, shadows materialized into evidence, emails that tied Celeste's aides to shell companies, invoices with inflated numbers, bank transfers. The ledger New had shown Lila earlier breathed across the wall like a slow, terrible map. The crowd tittered at first, disbelief catching like a physical reflex. Then cameras found the faces of donors. Phones lit like stars. Celeste's smile stiffened. "No," she said, voice steel under velvet. "You have no right to." No's voice was sharp but steady. "I have a responsibility to the truth. You have a responsibility to the people who trusted your name." A hush that had the texture of a held breath fell. Celeste's aides flailed, arranging statements that might turn the tide. But Lila had another thing planned, one that required the quiet of a blade being drawn. She had the recording. It was not salacious. It was not meant to be. It had been a conversation Celeste had thought private, caught by someone who had been present at the gala, on a private line where champagne had made tongues loose. The recording, if it existed, would show not only the hand that had lifted Lila's dress, but also the glee with which Celeste had orchestrated small cruelties as a way to keep attention off the ledgers. It would show her instructing a friend to teach the seamstress a lesson, and laughing as if cruelty were a currency. They played it. Celeste's voice, clear and bright, led with laughter that had a bite to it. The room recoiled as if stung. For the first time the confident armor cracked and the audience saw something else beneath, a woman who regarded the world as a place where people could be used for light entertainment. When the recording ended, Celeste's cheeks were pale. For a heartbeat she was all show and no substance, an expensive prop without an off switch. Something like panic fluttered through her aides. Statements were drafted. Damage control is a practiced art, and in many cases, it works. Celeste began to speak, her mouth framing the words she had prepared: regret, an apology, a promise to make amends. But the room, primed for more than rhetoric now, demanded accountability. And then she did what people do when their options are human and not mechanical. She made a choice in the moment. She stepped down from the stage, moved through the crowd with a limp practiced humility. She traversed the span between her and Omar, because she had been told that he had influence, that he could cut the board ties, that his signature on a letter could mean something real. There was a silence when she stopped before him, then a rustle like a breeze through scrim. Celeste's voice cracked, no longer the gleam of performance, but the rawness of someone who had run out of script. Omar, she said. The name came out a plea. Please. She looked at him not as a social equal but with the vulnerability of a person who needed something beyond reputation. She needed mercy. She knelt. The knees took the whole in like a photograph. People shifted in their seats like animals sensing a storm. Cameras blazed. Celeste's aides tried to lift her, to pull her back into the choreography of a PR rescue. But she remained on bent knees, looking toward a man who had become the axis upon which her fate might spin. Omar stood, rigid as a column. He had the sort of face that carried reasons like a ledger, quiet, measured, strong. For a second, the world narrowed to the space between Celeste's hands and Omar's shoes. Lila watched the scene with a strange, alien calm. She felt the muscles in her jaw move as if echoing the city's grinding gears. "Why are you asking me?" Omar asked simply, his hand resting at his side and not offering to lift her. There was no scolding in his tone, only clarity. He would not be theater. "Because you control the foundation," Celeste said, voice thin and quick. "You can." She reached for a name, a lever, anything that could be used to close the chasm. "Because my name appears on the board's paperwork does not mean I am your absolution," Omar said. He had the patient cadence of someone who did not conflate his private feelings with institutional justice. "The board answers to the law and the people who fund it." Celeste's eyes flicked to Lila, first to the woman who had been humiliated, then to the man who had made his life with her. The dynamic was liminal and fierce, the heiress who had perched on crowns of other people's misfortunes and the quiet woman who had turned those misfortunes into a lens. "Please," Celeste repeated, voice smaller. "I've made mistakes. I can apologize, publicly, to anyone. I will make donations." Omar looked at Lila for direction. The camera crews leaned forward as if the decision might be a public virtue they could photograph and print for the morning's front page. Lila felt the weight of all those eyes, but the choice she would make was not for them. It was only ever for herself. She thought of the seam that holds and how it does not bear witness to the cut until it is tested. She thought of the contractors who had waited for pay, and how their silence had been purchased with the glamour on stage. She thought of the small hands of their children, how the promised roof had become an entry in a ledger. She could, in the moment, pronounce judgment. She could demand Celeste be dragged into court, extracted into shame in a way that would be satisfying in the immediacy. She could speak and the city would nod and the papers would clack and the world would seem settled for a day. But years of mending taught Lila another thing. The courage of repair sometimes requires a hand stretched across the wound, not the slap of vindication. Her choice, she thought, must be neither cowardice nor vengeance. It must be a kind of reckoning that would not be satisfied by spectacle. "Lila," Omar said softly. He trusted her in a way that allowed him to step back and see the seam she would choose to stitch. She looked down at Celeste, kneeling, a human shape without pretense, vulnerability exposed in a way it had never been for the wealthy. She felt an ember of pity, and then the glow of resolution. "Get up," she said clearly. Celeste looked like someone who had been told to breathe after drowning. She rose, hands trembling, face a study in indignity. "I will apologize," she said, voice mechanical. "I will pay back the funds. I'll set up an oversight committee." Noor's eyes were on Lila, waiting to see whether this would be another performance. The room hummed with the electric folly of waiting for the next act. Lila met Celeste's gaze. "Apologies are words," she said. "Restitution is action. I want public and audited repayment plans. I want the contractors paid. I want a community board with power to audit and to fire." Celeste swallowed. "I'll do it," she said. But there was a tremor of calculation, what would save her fastest, and Lila saw it and met it with a gravity that removed calculation's comfort. "And I want you to come to the places you claim to support. See them with your hands, not your PR team. Sit with the families. If you are sincere, we'll know it in your actions." Celeste blinked. The audience murmured like a sea. She extended her hands, a clumsy, faltering motion toward Lila. "Please," she said, smaller still. Lila could have laughed. She could have demanded more. But the world, she knew, was not a ledger of equal return. Some would refund and vanish. Some would stand and change. She thought of the little clinic Omar had spoken of, how a life could be made steadier with the right repair. She thought of the contractors who had endured. "Do it," she said. "Make the payments. We will monitor them. You will apologize, not to save yourself, but because you understand the weight of what you've taken." Celeste's shoulders fell like a curtain being lowered. She accepted the terms. Cameras recorded, the press hungry for the drama, but what happened after the microphones went off was what mattered. Celeste arranged meetings. The board agreed to the oversight committee. Funds were rerouted. Invoices were paid. The city watched the machinery of accountability turn, not swiftly but with the deliberate movement of gears regaining traction. In the weeks that followed, Celeste's public persona shifted, not always smoothly. There were press conferences and uncomfortable visits to construction sites. There were moments when she flinched in public, and others when she seemed to absorb, awkwardly, the stories of people she once used as props. Whether she had been cured of cruelty was something only later pages could determine. But the contractors were paid. Lights were switched on in shelters. Children slept better under newly mended roofs. As for Lila, the story did not end in catharsis. There were days when she still woke to the phantom lift of fabric and the shock of public gaze. But her life unspooled into a new kind of ordinary justice. She continued to sew, to press hems, to stitch life together in small ways. She also began volunteering at the new clinic, showing up not as a heroine, but as someone who had learned how to sit with another's pain without letting it define her. Omar found, in the aftermath, a new humility married to action. He had stood in a legal posture and learned to let Lila take the public stage when that was her will. He watched her with a tenderness that was no longer protective in the old sense but admiring as one watches a strong seam hold under strain. Noor's work rippled outward. Her pieces won awards. She did what journalists do best. She kept watching. She wrote with a compassion that refused to explode people into caricatures. Her reportage made it harder for the city to look away. Celeste kept attending community meetings. Sometimes she stumbled. Sometimes she made gestures that were clumsy and felt like PR. But people began to measure her not only by what she said in magazine columns, but by the number of children under a roof, by the contractors who received their paychecks, by the lights that now stayed on in those fragile clinic rooms at night. What Lila had taught them all, most of all in the small, uncompromising way she had met humiliation, was a lesson about the difference between spectacle and repair. To choose mercy was not to dilute punishment. It was to insist on consequence that transformed rather than simply punished. She had not, in the end, demanded Celeste's ruin. She had demanded an accounting that would force change. Late one night, months after the hall had quieted from its chandeliers, Lila sat at her small table. The sewing machines hummed like an old lullaby. Omar's book lay open beside her. She threaded a needle, eyes catching on the thread as it slid through the eye, an act of bridging. Noor's latest column lay on the windowsill, headlined with nuance and hard facts. A letter arrived that day, anonymous, written in a scratchy hand. It said nothing like contrition or malice. It said, simply, "Thank you. You taught me to be better." Lila put the letter between two plates and pressed it with the weight of a thing kept. She did not believe that one letter could heal all wounds any more than one stitch could hold a ruined seam, but she also understood the small, cumulative power of acts. Outside, the city moved, its lights, its loud and its small. People would forget the exact shape of the night Celeste knelt once her public life continued. But they would remember the change in the vector of consequences. They would remember what it felt like when a woman, considered simple by those whose tastes were loud and expensive, straightened and made a demand on the world not for show, but for repair. Lila finished the hem she had been working on, slid the garment across the tabletop, and let the needle rest. The seam held. She smiled, not for cameras, not for print, but for the quiet miracle of something mended and the steadiness that comes from choosing the better right over the easier spectacle.